Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome, good morning. We're very happy to have you with us after a brilliant first day. Thank you to all the speakers, and we're very excited. This first session is going to be chaired by Hany, Dr. Rashwan.
So thank you everyone for coming to the second day. As we promised you, we promised a very productive and brilliant papers. And for the second day, we continue on this promise. The first session we have today is a brilliant combinations of papers. It's the session titled Translation and Non-Translation in the Islamic World. The first paper, we are happy to welcome a good colleague and friend, Peter Webb, who will present Arabic text as Ottoman Literary Phenomena, the Multilingual Lives of Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn. So Peter Webb is a lecturer in Arabic literature and culture at Leiden University. His research investigates the evolution of Arab identity and Muslim narratives of pre-Islamic history as developed in pre-modern Middle Eastern writings. Peter is the author of Imagining the Arabs, Arab Identity and the Rise of Islam, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2016, and has edited and translated works for the Library of Arabic Literature, including an edition translation of Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn, forthcoming in 2021. He is currently the principal investigator of Hany Research Grant from the Netherlands Organization of Scientific Research, Epic Past, Pre-Islam Through Muslim Eyes. Publications so far include a study of pre-Islamic outlaw stories, the Arab thieves, al-Makrizis, Lusus al-Arab, which published with Brill 2019. So please welcome Peter, and the floor is yours, Peter.
Great, thank you, Hany, and thank you all the organizers of this conference for giving me an opportunity to air my thoughts here today. Hany, hit this suspenseful music as I try to get the PowerPoint on. And hopefully that is all working. Yes?
Yep. Yes.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay. So this conference's theme of Muslim world multilingualism kind of goes to the core of the sort of the book that I'm working on right now in various guises. You can see the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn. I call it Arabic text as Ottoman Literary Phenomenon. And actually there's quite a lot more, indeed, language translation and other issues, and sometimes non-translation that goes into this book. And so without any further ado, try to get to it. As I said, there's multifaceted things one could do with this book, and I will try to highlight a couple of them here today. So just get to the basics. So the text is called the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn, and it's by Mamluk era literature Ibn Nubata. The Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn itself is a commentary of a letter written by the Andalusian Ibn Zaydun, a letter many of you might already know. It's the Risala al-Hazaliyya. And this letter is kind of a rejection letter in a sort of a love triangle. Ibn Zaydun pretended to be a sort of an ex-Umayyad princess of the Cordoba court, and he sort of, writing as her, rejected the propositions of one of her suitors. And so this sort of rejection letter, however, was impeccably written with very dense prose and all sorts of amazing allusions and metaphors and symbols of the style that Andalusian literature is very good at doing. And so I guess for a moment here we can represent that impeccable language of Ibn Zaydun by some impeccable ornamentation on one of the palaces of Ibn Zaydun's Cordoba. So the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn bi-Sharh Risalat Ibn Zaydun, the full name of Ibn Nubata's book, is, as the title says, a commentary on the letter, and in particular it's a discussion of and sort of biographies of all these myriad names of people that are mentioned in Ibn Zaydun's original letter. And those people are predominantly luminaries of the pre-Islamic past, Arabian and otherwise. And Ibn Nubata gives succinct and kind of accurate biographies for all of these sort of famous characters. And so because a core of my research is looking at Muslim reconstructions of pre-Islam, I chose to work with Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn and actually produce a new Arabic edition and a translation for the Library of Arabic Literature. And at the outset, this seemed like a very straightforward thing to do. Brockelman said there were about 15 or just under 20 manuscripts of the book. 3 of them are actually here in the Leiden library. And so I thought, okay, I can work on this rather easily. But then quickly complications arose. And to date, and I haven't finished looking yet actually for manuscripts, but I found 130. And while the translation and the edition of the book is actually completed, the scope for thinking about the afterlife of this book is as interesting a proposition as it is also a mammoth undertaking. So there are myriad topics which you can look at, and I will try to explain here just a very broad overview, and then one specific case study that goes to the heart of questions about multilingualism. So in terms of the overview, the book, in terms of its sort of genesis and spread, is actually all about translation in many different capacities. And we have sort of the movement of literary material between places, between times, between cultures, and also between languages. And I can try to sort of show you a little bit of that via this via a map, if it will turn on me. Here we go. So if so we look at the Islamic world represented here, the stories that are the core of Ibn Zaydun's material are about Jahiliyyah, pre-Islam in general, and they kind of coalesce in Iraq in the 9th and 10th centuries, so between 200 and 350 AH. So the first movement in terms of this book was their sort of reformulation in Andalusia through Ibn Zaydun's letter. So he sort of absorbed these various tales and kind of gave them meaning and presented it in the letter. And then that was sort of around sort of circa 440, 1075 when he wrote it. Then over the succeeding centuries, the letter worked its way back east. And so we don't have too many early surviving copies of the letter, but we know from anecdotal evidence that it was circulating in Egypt and in Syria and probably beyond in sort of 100, 200 years after Ibn Zaydun. So as a result of the letter's reemergence in the East, it kindled quite a lot of interest. And so somewhere between 719 and 730, then working in Hama, Ibn Nubata was asked to make a commentary on the letter. And so there it goes. Now, in the next 150 years, i.e. through the rest of the Mamluk period, the book seems to have enjoyed maybe what we could say is sort of modest popularity. There are some references to it in the sort of biographical literature. There are also 3 manuscripts that can be identified with Syria in the Mamluk period, and they are the oldest manuscripts that survive of the book. And so that's kind of the situation at the end of the Mamluk era around sort of 900, circa 1500 AD. But then over the next 200 years, and here's where it gets kind of interesting, is that there is a real explosion, a profusion of interest in this book. And if we look at sort of, okay, what happens to the next manuscripts over these 200 years, they're everywhere. Okay, and so this book is basically Mali to India. You can find a copy of this, of Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn. And it was a very popular and a very widely circulated book, as you can see. And it's kind of remarkable by the nature of the book, this spread of manuscripts. I mean, if it was Bukhari Sahih, or if it was, you know, al-Hisn al-Hasin, or if it was some Dala'il al-Khairat or something, fine, we'll have manuscripts everywhere. But here we have a little tiny adab book that's talking about Jahiliyyah, and somebody in Mauritania and somebody in India also want to read about it. And there's this proliferation of books everywhere. And I really believe that if you were in the Islamic world in 1700 and you lived in a city that had some scholarly pretensions, you would actually be near a copy of this book. Okay, it was available. I found it sort of everywhere, and I haven't really even finished looking yet, but this is what we've got. And what I want to focus on today, or at least half of what I want to focus on today, is that there's a particular interest in this book in Ottoman Turkey, or in sort of what's today modern Turkey, and sort of in the scholarly centers of the core of the Ottoman Empire. Most of the manuscripts, sort of numerically the biggest number of manuscripts, come from there. There are currently 18 still held in Istanbul. And there are also maybe 20 or perhaps 30 manuscripts that were made in Istanbul, which have now worked their ways into European libraries. So there's sort of, you know, somewhere around 40 Ottoman manuscripts. And so there's a real sort of interest in this book in the Ottoman world. And that interest is underlined because after the 17th century, an Ottoman translation of the book was made. We have Halil Efendizadeh, He is an Ottoman scholar who decided to translate the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn to put it into Ottoman Turkish. He did so in 1168, 1755. And I found, I think, 13 or 14 manuscripts of the Ottoman translation as well, circulating in Istanbul, and also a couple of them in libraries in Europe. And so then just we're going beyond the time I want to focus on here, but the book was printed in Ottoman Istanbul. In actually the first sort of printing of the book was also done in Ottoman lands, and eventually it followed in Egypt at the end of the 19th century. But in any event, from this very quick overview, we can see that we have this Arabic language book, which is, to a large extent, an Ottoman literary phenomenon. It caught the attention of Turkic peoples or people sort of living in the Ottoman, what is now Ottoman Turkey. And what's sort of kind of obvious is that the number of manuscripts in Istanbul and around dwarfs the amount in Syria, where the book actually was originally written. And so we could easily say that Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn really enjoyed its greatest success outside of the linguistic, the temporal, and the geographical context in which it was originally written. And so one of the questions that I'm one set of the questions that I'm interested in looking at is what made this book so attractive beyond sort of native Arabic speaking audiences? And then, why was it selected for translation? And sort of what did all these people do with the material in the book? So you can see with 100 odd manuscripts or 130 manuscripts plus the other manuscripts of the translations, et cetera, these questions are actually quite enormous. There's a lot of codicological work. And this is sort of the mammoth scope that I alluded to a few moments ago. But just to kind of finish the overview off before we get specific on one issue, at the high level, the book is sort of a very handy resource to get up to speed on what one needs to know about staple elements of pre-Islamic sort of Islam, so pre-Islamic sort of cultural elements, from Arabian heroes, some Greeks and some Romans and a bunch of Persians. And in a way, the way I'm sort of thinking about Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn as a book is it is, by loose analogy, a little bit like Apollodorus's Bibliotheca. This is a Greek text which talks about all that you need to know about sort of Greek mythology. It's not written very well. It's not a particularly beautiful book, and it sort of doesn't have great stories, but it has everything in a digest form that you need to know, with just enough narrative to kind of make the stories semi-interesting to read. And so the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn is very much like this. It, if you wanted to know about pre-Islam in a kind of a sense of what do we know about pre-Islam from an Islamic perspective, of course you could read the Kitab al-Aghani, and that's going to give you a lot more information. But that's 24 volumes long. Ibn Nubata's Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn is just one. And so if you haven't got the time, which most people don't have to go through 24 volumes of the Kitab al-Aghani, you can get all the names and all the big facts that you need out of the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn. And so it fits this sort of niche of a condensed access to a cultural sort of canon of knowledge. And so my hypothesis so far is that sort of Ottomans and various other people felt the cultural capital, the value of the cultural capital of knowing about pre-Islamic Arabia and pre-Islamic Persians and a bit about the Romans. And sort of this sort of mythos of the Jahiliyyah was kind of was this component of being cultured, something like a classical tradition. And the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn was your easy way in. And so therefore it became highly demanded, high in demand amongst people who wanted a non-specialist, but a sort of a reasonably civilized sort of want to adopt the trappings of civilization without having to become specialists. And so because obviously many of these people where the manuscripts are created are not native Arabic readers, there's also a logic that they might want the information in as compact a form, and hence driving the production of this book much faster than, for instance, the Kitab al-Aghani or the other go-to sources for the sort of the original information on Muslim stories about al-Jahiliyyah. So that sort of leads then to a whole other set of questions, which is how did Ottoman readers cope with reading the Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn? Right? We identify there's lots of manuscripts, and they're relatively easy to read, but there is quite a lot of poetry. There is quite a lot of sort of semi-difficult prose to deal with in Arabic. And the wealth of manuscripts we have does enable us to kind of see physically how this book was used in sort of the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries in particular. And so there's a whole array of complex codicological questions and the requirement to look at a lot of manuscripts in order to answer those properly. But what I want to focus today in my remaining time is an intriguing quirk of the Arabic manuscript, which permits direct inquiry into these questions. And that's because there is a line of Persian which is cited in an anecdote in the middle of the book. And so the presence of the Persian line kind of gives us insight into the sort of multilingualism at sort of the business end of consumption of books, the everyday encounter of non-Arabic in an Arabic text. And given the spread of manuscripts, we can appraise sort of how non-native Arabic readers encountered this Arabic. And these, I stress, are kind of the everyday readers, right? This is not the sort of high-minded, bright stars of literary poets and geniuses. These are sort of the everyday readers, the reading folk on the ground. So let's go very quickly. So the anecdote involves a story about Iyas ibn Muawiyah and Ghaylan al-Dimashqi. These are two Umayyad era figures. Iyas ibn Muawiyah is a judge and a kind of a quick-witted figure. Ghaylan al-Dimashqi was sort of a heretic in Sunni perspectives because he believed in free will. So according to the story, Iyas asked Ghaylan, would you like me to tell you what the saved souls in paradise say, and the damned in hell, and the angels, and the devil, and the Arabs, and the Persians? So basically, Ghaylan was excited. Do tell. And the anecdote kind of proceeds to show that all of these people do not believe in predestination. They believe in predestination, that there is no such thing as free will. And so Ghaylan and his theology is completely wrong, because everybody on earth and in the cosmos believes in predestination. Now, what concerns us is what the Arabs and the Persians say. So the Arabs, of course, say something in poetry. لا يمنعنك الطير شيئا أردته فقد خضت بالأقلام ما كنت لاقيا. Right? So it is the fortune signs of no power to defect your will. It's already been written what's in store for you. So it's all predetermined. Now the Persian, this is a bit tricky, and this is what I want to talk about here. So it is harce bayad on bovad hamar as pish, which means something like everything which shall be has always been thus predestined. Now, the interesting thing is this is a unique anecdote. I've not found it anywhere else in Arabic literature. It's only in Ibn Nubata's text and in one other source, which was a major source of his, Ibn Asakir's Tarikh Medina Dimashq. So the story is in that book, and that's where Ibn Nubata copied it from. Now, the poem and the Persian line do not appear anywhere else. And so whoever originated this story must have been able to write a line of Arabic poetry or compose a line of Arabic poetry himself, and also come up with a little catchy Persian statement. And so we clearly have a bilingual person at the origin point of this anecdote. And that makes sense because Ibn Asakir tells us that the story comes in the Isnad from somebody in Isfahan. Okay, so we have sort of an Isfahani milieu for where the story emerges, and that's fine, Arabic and Persian. Now, what gets odd is what happens next, because as the story is circulating in Arabic, the manuscripts mess up the Persian. And so very quickly, the current printed version of Medina Dimashq, Tarikh Medina Dimashq, kind of the Persian doesn't make any sense. Haraj manandan lo dunama razan shet. I don't think that means anything. It's been corrupted. And we can tell the same sort of thing happened in the manuscripts with Ibn Nubata's text. Here's the earliest manuscript. It's currently in Iran, but it was made in Syria. And you can see the line of the Persian is written without points. And that's quite important because this manuscript is fully pointed, as you can tell from the line above, and mostly voweled. The copyist, who's an Arabic copyist, really didn't quite know how to deal with this. And so I'm just going to write the consonantal skeleton and I'm going to let it go. And once you let it go amongst Arabic copyists, it gets worse. And so here it is in an Egyptian one on top and in a Yemeni version of the manuscript on the bottom. Those aren't really good Persian. They're introducing they're introducing further corruptions. And so we can see the Arabic copyists are not really part of this multilingual game to deal with Persian. What's interesting is also in Lebanon, here's a manuscript that was owned by Ahmed Faris Chidiaq, the great sort of literary figure of the 19th century. He owned Sarḥ al-ʿuyūn. He made lots of manuscript little annotations about the book, but this is his page of the Persian, and he's got also it's quite corrupted. Or it doesn't make sense, and so he's sort of clearly skipping over it. Now, what's interesting, I'll try to do this in the next couple minutes, Hany, if that's okay. when we look at the Ottoman manuscripts, what's really intriguing is that they're not much better than the Arabic ones. So these Ottoman audiences presumably know more Persian and more Ottoman. Via knowing Ottoman, you know more Persian. But you can see in the top one in Istanbul, it's left mostly unpointed. The Istanbul Hamidiyya on the bottom actually adds some points, but they're not. You can see here he's added a ya here and a ta here, but that's incorrect. And so he's not rendering the Persian particularly accurately either. Just another one example of this one is mostly unpointed, but a little bit incorrect. And bizarrely, it has at the end of the manuscript, this is a very high quality manuscript, where it says that the read here is قابلته وصححت حسب الطاقة والاقتدار في مدينة كوز الحصار. So there's a person who's gone over this manuscript in the town of Kuz al-Ahsar, which is in Leiden province in modern Turkey, and he didn't correct the Persian here either. And so to cut a long story short, I can kind of skip over this one for time reasons. Here's another guy who's got it wrong. He put in an Arabic explanation, which also isn't quite what the Persian says. It's kind of a guess going on the idea of predestination. But to cut a long story short, there's only one Ottoman manuscript that's got it right. And he sort of really intervenes in the text, and he writes it, Harche boyad baz bovad hamaras pish. And so all that will come to be always has been predestined. That's fine. And you can look at how he's written it, and he has really made an effort to intervene on the Arabic and correct it. But it's intriguing that out of those 40 manuscripts in Ottoman Turkey, there's only one that actually has engaged with the Persian to correct it. And where it gets even weirder is if we look at the manuscripts from Iran, you can see that the Tehran one was never corrected by a subsequent Persian reader. And the bottom one was actually copied in Mashhad in the 18th century. And he also has got the text incorrect. So the Persian copyist of this text is also finds this corrupted Persian, and he actually starts adding a Hamza in, which I've been told doesn't make any sense in Persian at all. And I can't make sense of it either. So last thing, just the last thing I want to focus on then is, so we have this sort of sense where there's this non-engagement with the Persian. Arabic readers might be happy to see something that doesn't make any sense, and that stands for being Persian, and that's cool because we can't make any sound out of it, so that's clearly Ajami. But it's interesting that Ottoman and Persian readers are also not correcting the text, and maybe that implies they're kind of skipping over quickly and not really dealing with it. But there is somebody that does need to deal with it, and that's our Khalil Efendizadeh, because he translated the book into Ottoman. So as we all know, when we're translating, we can't be lazy and we can't skip. We got to actually do some work. And so he tried, and he put Wajam Guyand K Sang. Okay, so just very quickly, he put something in there. Guyand Sang Lal Shabad Dar Maqami Sabr Ari Shabad Valik Bikhun Chakar Shabad. Okay, so we clearly got some Persian here. Okay, but the Persian, it doesn't really have anything to do with predestination. They say a stone, if patient, can become a ruby. Indeed, it may, but a liver must be soaked in blood. Now, I don't really know what that has to do with predestination in the story. Not only is it therefore non sequitur, but also it's a line from Hafez, right? It's in his Ghazal 226. And so as opposed to just sort of translating, he's just like, okay, I'll throw in a line of Persian from a poem. And even though Hafez died 600 years after the people in the anecdote. And so basically, it's an intriguing approach to translation in the Ottoman there. I just want to leave with the fact that the book was also being translated into Latin at the same time as it was in Ottoman by Johann Friedrich Hirt. And so as opposed to, before we get too mad at the Ottoman copyist, Johann didn't do much better job. And here in his translation, we have Qalat al-Furs, and he, in his edition, and he really just truncated the Persian completely. And then he didn't write anything per se dikunt, the Persians say, and he didn't try it at all. And so basically we have a thoroughly popular Arabic book, but correcting its one line of non-Arabic was obviously not a popular pastime. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Peter. This is really wonderful journey through the copier and intertextuality as well. So you took us back to a real medieval world where no one copy survived. No one, the author himself doesn't survive with the copier intentions. So well done, and we are really happy to have you with us. So quickly, I will go to the second paper. It's Our second presenter is Muneer Aram Kuzhiyan, is assistant professor of English at Aligarh Muslim University in India. His primary research interests lie at the intersection of comparative literature and cultural studies. His PhD work explored devotional performance narratives in Mabila, Muslim literary culture. His key publications include Poetics of Piety, Genre, Self-Fashioning, and the Mabila Life Space in 2016, Journal of Royal Asiatic Society, Cambridge University Press. So please welcome Muneer for the second presentation.
Okay, thank you, Hany, and I thank all the organizers for the opportunity. I'm quite delighted to be part of this conference. So in the interest of time, I will read my paper. Let me begin. Can you hear me? A recent revisionist scholarship on world literature has allowed for a reimagining of the categories of both world and literature towards an increased sensitivity to vernacular literary cultures and diverse cultural products and discourses. In this scholarship, the vernacular and the local become important perspectives and locations from which look at the world within and beyond. As Francisca Orsini notes, the local comes to be understood as productive space that co-constitutes the global, thereby giving birth to locals, to use Arjuna Padure's oft-cited term. Here, instead of looking at the world from a putative Euro-American core, we are urged upon to see and view the world from the so-called peripheries from the global south. The idea of multilingual locals, to borrow from Orsini again, is most useful when it comes to the study of Indian or South Asian literary cultures. And the case of Arabi Malayalam, the subject of my paper today, is no exception. Building on these interventions in world literature studies and shifting the focus of attention to the interstices of both the world and the literary, my paper wants to explore a greatly understudied vernacular literary culture from Kerala known as Arabi Malayalam. Arabi Malayalam is a hybrid dialect of Malayalam written in the Arabic script with an unmistakably multilingual vocabulary drawn from such languages as Arabic, Tamil, Persian, and Sanskrit. From at least the early 17th century onwards, this language tradition has served as the popular vehicle for literary expression among the Mapila Muslims of Kerala. So Mapilas they geographically hail from Malabar in the northern part of Kerala, present-day Kerala. This tradition presents a diversely vast corpus of text across genres, ranging from devotional song poems and praise poetry to heroic ballads and romances, besides a diverse body of translation from Arabic, Persian, etc. Crucial to the internal architecture of Arabi Malayalam literary culture is the mutual co-production of text and community. That is, individuals and communities produce literary text, and literary text in turn produce individual or community identity. Now, the origins of Arabi Malayalam are shrouded in obscurity. However, it has been suggested that this language hybrid must have been in gestation and subsequently born with the beginning of Arab contact with what we today call Kerala, that dates back to several centuries before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad in 6th century Mecca. The Arabian way of crafting novel communicative forms included employing the Arabic script to write the vernaculars they encountered abroad. This gave rise to a variety of language mixtures or blends such as Arabi Sindhi, Arabi Punjabi, or even Arvi or Arabi Tamil in the case of South Asia, or the Ajami in Africa, and the Javi and Pegon in Southeast Asia, to cite a few. Arabi Malayalam is no exception, though it may be the case that Arabs might have started creating a hybridized dialect, however embryonic, that we now call Arabi Malayalam in collaboration with the local inhabitants of Kerala, ever since they opened their trade contacts with this part of the world, With the advent of Islam into Kerala, the need for a medium of expression in the form of Arabi Malayalam that would fulfill the pedagogic requirements of the new faith must have been felt with a stronger sense of immediacy and urgency. The available indigenous and foreign historical accounts of Malayali Muslims show beyond doubt that Muslims had established themselves as a community with a strong sense of Islamic identity in Malabar by the 14th century, at least by the 14th century. And by the time the earliest extant work in Arabi Malayalam saw the light in the early 17th century, this form of language has already been in wide circulation as a fully fledged medium of literary expression, a fact attested to by the relatively highly developed language found in Muhyiddin Mala of 1607, the earliest extant Arabi Malayalam work. Nevertheless, the story of the origins and development of Arabi Malayalam is also the story of Arabs' ancient trade relations with Malabar and of the appearance of Islam on the southwest coast of India. And therefore, the origins of both these historical events still remain largely unsettled. Now, by hybridizing mainly Arabic and Malayalam, Arabi Malayalam presents itself as a parallel road to vernacularization when compared with what might be called, to use Sheldon Pollock's by now famous phrase, the cosmopolitan vernacular of Manipravalam. Manipravalam meaning rubies and coral, lapidary phrase, rubies and coral signifying the union of Kerala Bhasha, that is Malayalam and Sanskrit, which existed in Kerala during the medieval and early modern periods and eventually transformed itself into the modern Malayalam language. Manipravalam can be construed as the complex appropriation of cosmopolitan language, Sanskrit, into the vernacular Malayalam, which eventually sought to assert its supremacy as the language of the high, quote unquote, high, dominant Hindu caste at the expense of other local, less politically powerful forms of the vernacular. Now, Arabi Malayalam, in its turn, appropriates a cosmopolitan language, that is Arabic, into vernacular, namely Malayalam. Arabi Malayalam prides itself on an enormous wealth of literature in verse and prose, covering a wide range of themes and concerns, and therefore rightly assumes the status of the literary language of Mapilas from at least early 17th century, when the earliest extant work in this linguistic tradition appeared on the scene, which is a status this language hybrid maintained well into the early decades of the 20th century. Though Arabic, on top of its primary liturgical use, was also the scholarly cosmopolitan language of the day for the Mapila literati in late medieval and modern Kerala, because there is an immense amount of Arabic literature produced by Mapila scholars themselves in Arabic, or in Arabi Malayalam, in Arabic as well. So Arabic has been a cosmopolitan language for the Mapila literati in the medieval and modern Kerala, but it had confined itself to the specialized few for obvious reasons. In contrast, Arabi Malayalam, thanks to its wider popular appeal, became the literary language of the larger Mapila community, in contrast to Arabic, which was an elite language. In the centuries following the birth of Muhyiddin Mala in 1607, such that by the 20th century, Arabi Malayalam had witnessed a stupendous efflorescence of wide-ranging literary activity. It is interesting to note that the whole corpus of Arabi Malayalam poetry had been known as Sabina or Sefina Patugal, that is Sabina songs, Sabina or Sefina Patugal, well into the latter part of the 20th century. The current term Mapila Patugal or Mapila songs, that is the appellation by which all Mapila songs written in Arabi Malayalam usually are known. The current term Mapila songs began to be used to denote the poetic verse in Arabi Malayalam about 7 or so decades ago. Until then, Mapilas had been more usually referring to Arabi Malayalam songs not as Mapila Patugal, but as Sabina Patugal, Sabina songs. This is very interesting. Sabina. I want to briefly foreground the etymological niceties of the word Sabina in order to shed light on the multilingual character of Arabi Malayalam. The Sabina is available. The Sabina, by the way, also means the prayer book, okay, in which all these songs circulate. So it's also a prayer book, right? Because these Mapila songs, they are circulated in these prayer books called Sabina, and hence Sabina songs, Sabina Portugal, right? So the Sabina is available in small and large editions and generally contains a wide-ranging repertoire of devotional literature such as the Mala, the Maulud, litanies, hymns, and praise poems in Arabic and Arabi Malayalam that are vital to the religious life of the Mapilas. There are two plausible yet conflicting opinions on the etymology of the word Sabina, but they both emphasize an important dimension of Arabi Malayalam literary culture. One opinion has it that Sabina is a corruption of the Arabic word Safina, meaning ship. Okay, Safina meaning ship. Consequently, O Abu, a well-known Mapila scholar, traces the origins of Sabina or Safina as the label for Mapila songs to a famous Mapila song known as called Kappapatu, that is ship song, Kappal meaning in Malayalam, ship, Safina, right? Written by Kunyayin Musliya. This ship song is a philosophical poem which likens the human body and human life to a sailing ship and the voyage in the ship, respectively. According to Abu, the popularity of this poem was so immense that the word Safina, meaning ship, or in Malayalam, kappal, right, subsequently came to be used synecdochically as the generic name for the whole body of Arabi Malayalam poetry. So this is one interpretation. Sabina having been derived from the Arabic Safina, meaning ship. Now, the second opinion takes the word Sabina to be a corruption of the Persian word Shabina. The Persian word Shabina, which means nocturnal or taking place at night. Since Mapilas used to and continue to recite mauluds, malas, praise poems, litanies, and various Arabi Malayalam poetry from the prayer book daily at night, the prayer book was metonymically called Sabina or Safina, meaning that which is recited at night. So Shabina, Shabina, that which is recited at night. Now, both these opinions, even as they seem to contradict each other, underlie two different aspects of the multilingual Arabi Malayalam. In the first case, through the trope of the ship, Arabic Safina, which signifies, among other things, fluidity, mobility, and border crossing, the multilingual transoceanic character of Arabi Malayalam as a language hybrid from Malabar in the Indian Ocean world is brought to light. Now, in the second version, that is the Persian Shabina, which connotes nocturnal recitation, the performative world of Arabi Malayalam literary culture is underscored as it punctuated the daily life of many Mapilas. It may be noted that the very word Malabar, in this case, Malabar, as many of you know, is not atypical in this respect, because the word, its hybrid etymology, that is the etymology of the word Malabar, is telling that Dravidian Mala meaning hill, and the affix bar derived either from Arabic bar, meaning land, as in the Quranic verse, Lahar al-Fasad, fil barri wal bahr, bar, meaning land, or the Persian bar, meaning country or coast, as in Zangbar. Now, two popular Arabi Malayalam songs that circulate in the Sabina or the prayer book are Muhyiddin Mala and Nafisat Mala. The Mala or Mala Patu or Mala song is a devotional performance ballad that venerates a revered Islamic figure, such as a Sufi, by narrating the glorious events of his or her life. Muhyiddin Mala is the first Arabi Malayalam work to have come down to us with known authorship and date of composition. Written by Qali Muhammad of Calicut, himself a renowned Islamic scholar of his time who has written various works in Arabic as well. In the Malayalam year of 782, which corresponds to 1607 AD, Muhyiddin Mala extols the Arabi Malayalam work. Muhyiddin Mala extols the virtues of the most renowned Sufi figure, Sheikh Muhyiddin Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, the founder of the Qadiri Sufi order. Drawing on the extant body of Islamic literature on the life and example of Sheikh al-Jilani, Qali Muhammad has fashioned Muhyiddin Mala in 155 couplets that fervently celebrate the virtues and miracles of the revered Sufi master. The grand style of the poem is mirrored in the virtual parade of sublime epithets and dramatic descriptions running through the poem. After the customary, so the poem begins with the customary invocations, like all Islamic devotional songs do. So let me recite to you the incipit of the Mala, just to get a taste of that. And I'm reciting this to you because we're talking about vernacularization. The vernacularization of Arabic actually takes place not just at the level of text, but also at the level of performance, in the way that people recite these songs. So that's very interesting, not just at the level of text, but also in the way people recite it. So here is the incipit of Muhyiddin Mala, written in 1607 by Qali Muhammad. Allah tiri perum tudiyum salavatum adinal tudanguvan arul cheida bedambar alam mudayeven yegallarulale aye Muhammad avargile anovar ella kilayilum Bankile ayover, yella tishailum, kelimi gechover, Sultanul Awliya, it's in Arabic, Sultanul Awliya, yen perullover, Sayyida Vartayum, Bavayum Anover. So one see, this is the incipit, the opening lines of Muhyiddin Mala. The Arabi Malayalam, the earliest extant work in Arabi Malayalam. And you see words drawn from not only Arabic phrases are quite predominant, but also Bedambar, Pegambar, a Persian word, Pegambar, meaning messenger, a reference to the prophets, and so on and so forth, right? So after the customary invocations, the name of the object of veneration, Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, is withheld until the 13th line, when His Majesty, Excellence, and Supremacy as the King of the Friends of God, that is Sultanul Awliya, right? Sultanul Awliya, Sheikh Muhyiddin Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. That is, so His Excellence and Supremacy as the King of the Friends of God have already been proclaimed emphatically through an impressive array of descriptive utterances. Interestingly, Qali Muhammad, despite his Mala's local flavor and its resemblance to both Arabic and Dravidian metrics, links his work to the tradition of Islamic literature that thematizes the exemplary status of Sufi figures. Now, if we go forward to the 20th century, another Mala, which has been influenced by Muhyiddin Mala itself, this is Nafisat Mala, okay, Nafisat Mala, which is written by Naalagat Kunyi Muhyiddin, who died in 1919, so a early 20th century work. Nafisat Mala lavishes eulogy on Sayyida Nafisa, or the Lady Nafisa, great granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad, who lived in Cairo, Al-Qahira, Egypt, and was well known for her piety and mystical powers. The Mala comprises 124 couplets and follows standard generic conventions, such as beginning in the name of God, like in the case of Muhyiddin Mala also, beginning with the name of God, in the name of God, Bismi, and divine invocations, and invoking blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad.
Muneer, Muneer, you have only 1 minute to conclude, please.
Okay. So what sets Nafisat Mala, the second Mala that I have just mentioned, what sets it apart is its heavy use of Arabic. Heavy use of Arabic words and phrases with little or no effort at vernacularizing them. So this is very interesting. And unlike Muhyiddin Mala, the incipit of Nafisat Mala is full of Arabic words quite heavily, predominantly. So again, the first 2 lines so that you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. This is Nafisat Mala. Bismiyum hamdum salatum nal salamum munne billine fisat mala nyan tudangidunne. I begin this mala in the name of God, etc., etc. Then there follows 4 or 5 Arabic lines, right? Mushaffi'un mufallilum muqaddamun nurullah musilum muhayminum muballighun sa'dullah. Classical Arabic. Mustafa musaddiqun mujibun habibullah mundirun mubashirun mubarrun kalimullah muslihun mukarramun mubinun siratullah muzakkirun muqaddasun mujabun najiyullah muktafin muammilun muqimun safiyullah mujtaba mudathirun muti'un abdullah.
Thank you so much.
So the point is that vernacularization of Arabic takes place not at just a second. The vernacularization of Arabic takes place not just at the level of the text, but also at the level of performance. Thank you, Hany. Thank you so much. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Muneer. Thank you so much. It's a brilliant performance and a good lecture. Thank you so much for that. We go now to the third presenter. It's Ayelet Kotler, and she is a PhD candidate in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilization at University of Chicago. Her dissertations explores Persian retellings of Sanskrit narrative literature from the early Mughal period through questions pertaining to literary history, intertextuality, narratology, and poetics. Her title today is Translation as Poetic Point of Departure, Personizing the Ramayana in early 17th century India. So the floor is yours, Ayelet.
Hi, thank you so much, and good morning or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just share my screen with you. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, you see it well?
Awesome. Okay, so let me just begin reading my paper. Persian translations of Sanskrit texts from the Mughal period in South Asia have for centuries been considered in Western scholarship as inaccurate, unfaithful, or loose translations produced by authors who did not know Sanskrit well enough or who completely disregarded the standards of translation. In the last couple of decades, scholars have begun moving away from these critical notions and examine more carefully the historical, religious, and social circumstances that shaped these Persian translations and informed their creation. The translations that have received the most attention so far are of scientific and theological treatises written in prose, usually unornate. Versified poetic retellings of Sanskrit narratives, however, are still considered by many to be so unfaithful to their sources that it would be pointless to even explore them vis-a-vis their hypotexts. The infatuation with faithfulness, however, limits the scope of analysis, especially when it comes to poetic retellings. By confining ourselves to the question of whether or not a composition that aims to be poetic and aesthetically pleasing can also reflect the message of the source text faithfully, we miss the variety of intertextual relationships and literary procedures that take place in the transposition between two languages and two narratives. This paper thus suggests that when examining Mughal-era Persian translations in Sanskrit narratives, we should not expect a faithful transposition, not because the Mughal authors were incapable of it, but because it was not their goal. Faithfulness in translation was a means to an end, a starting point from which poets departed to elaborate and comment on the Sanskrit text in a new Persian narrative. Assessing whether a retelling is faithful to the Sanskrit source or not is an ineffective question, the wrong yardstick with which to measure these Persian literary translations. It simply cannot reveal much about the composition process and the role of translation in it. Once we move away from this binary question of faithfulness, we can make room for more productive questions, like what were the kinds of changes that took place in the textual transposition, how they happened, and why. This approach would also help us in freeing ourselves from the futile search after source texts. It's futile because more often than not, there is no way for us to identify the source text that Mughal poets and translators used. The most we can do is to identify the narrative tradition, the version of the story as it was told by a certain poet in the past, with which our Mughal authors worked. For the analysis I'm offering, it's enough. The modifications and manipulations in the Sanskrit retelling are so numerous anyway, that it makes more sense to explore them through theories of narratology and in comparison with the narrative on which they relied in the retellings, rather than side by side with a specific recension or a manuscript. This presentation is a much shorter version of the dissertation chapter I'm currently writing, in which I unpack the ways Persian poets read, translated, manipulated, interpreted, and ornamented their source texts to compose their poems in Persian. Due to the limitations of time, today I focus only on a small handful of excerpts from an early 17th century Persian Ramayana, composed by the Mughal era poet Masih of Panipat. I realize that this is not a South Asia related conference, so let me begin very briefly with some necessary background before diving into the text. The Ramayana, one of the two famous Sanskrit epics, was composed by the legendary poet Valmiki some 2,000 years ago. It was retold in Sanskrit and numerous other South Asian languages many times throughout history. Some of these retellings, like the old Hindi poem Ramcharitmanas by the poet Tulsidas, have completely distanced themselves from the ancient telling by Valmiki and created a whole new narrative based on the deeds of Rama. Starting at the end of the 16th century, the Ramayana was rendered dozens of times in Persian, in prose and verse, at the Mughal court and other sub-imperial courts throughout the subcontinent. All the Persian retellings I managed to examine so far seem to have followed Valmiki's narrative, while modifying it in various ways to a greater or lesser extent. Masih's poem from the year 1617, known as Masnavi Aram Sita, after the name of the two protagonists, is the first versified retelling of the epic in Persian. While it was not commissioned by the Mughal court, Masih used the poem to make a bid for royal patronage and fashioned his Masnavi as a court romance along the lines of Tazegui poetry. So let's begin exploring some of the changes that took place in the transposition process of the Ramayana into Persian. The most readily apparent change is, of course, the fact that the poem is written in accordance with Persian prosody, and this is to be expected, and I will not dwell on that here. Other scholars have also discussed in recent years the search of equivalence that is noticeable in Persian translations of Sanskrit texts. That is the attempt by Persian authors to find equivalent Persian terms for the religious terminology they encountered in their sources. While this practice is quite common in translations of scientific and theological compositions as a way to elucidate the knowledge system and arguments of the source texts, in narrative poetry, we actually see poets preserving many Sanskrit terms and names, oftentimes for the sake of exoticizing and foreignizing their subject matter. It should also be mentioned here that Persian poetic retellings were usually composed after a prose rendition of the stories has been produced. And so the poets may have been able to rely on some acquaintance of the readership with South Asian traditions. There are two major processes that take place in Masih's transposition of the Ramayana into Persian alongside translation. The first process is the structuring of a new narrative based on the narrative events of Valmiki's Ramayana. And the second process is ornamentation and poetic elaboration on that new narrative. Let me begin with the first one. Literary transposition for the purpose of creating a new narrative consists of several textual procedures that take place simultaneously. Reduction and augmentation of the narrative are the most common ones. In Masih's Masnavi, some episodes are told very briefly or even excised entirely, and some scenes are handled with great detail in comparison with the Sanskrit epic. However, the episodes that are left out do not normally alter the main narrative. These are either episodes that repeat stories that have already been told once earlier in the narrative, or will have been told later in a different place, or smaller plot developments and embedded stories that digress from the primary sequence of events. Some episodes are abridged or even just briefly mentioned to make room for expansion on specific details from them that the author found particularly thought-provoking, poetically rich, or just exotic and intriguing. For example, one of the stories in the Ramayana tells that when King Jasrat wished for an heir, one of his viziers suggested he perform the royal horse sacrifice, known in Sanskrit as Yajna Ashvamedha. The Sanskrit epic tells in enormous detail one aspect of the sacrifice, the 1-year process of building a new city in which the horse will be eventually sacrificed. The Sanskrit epic lists all the stages, the instruments, the materials used, the priests involved and their blessings of the process, and so on. It reads as a manual on how to perform the sacrifice. Masich's poem, by contrast, does not dwell on that at all. The poet mentions that a new city should be built and then explores an entirely different aspect of the sacrifice. They released a black-eared horse. Behind it were victorious warriors. Adorning its neck was a golden plate, bright like the full moon at night. Written on that golden plate was the king's name, like a shining imprint on the glowing sun. After his name, it said, "This royal horse is sacrificed by Jasrat for the ritual of the Yajna. Any king who thinks of war should harness their horses and marshal their soldiers. Anyone who thinks peace would make sense should give tribute and attend the Yajna." The horse went through the 7 climbs and came back. The king sat observing its path. They all carried Jasrat's tribute on their heads, the emperor of Turkestan, China, and Rome. During the period when his horse was roaming, the construction of the new city was completed. Then the king, with his world-exploring horse, named that new city the capital of the empire. According to the 4 Vedas, the fire worshippers sacrificed the horse in the Yajna. They burned that horse before them in the fire, for this is the ritual of the Ashvamedha Yajna. So instead of remaining in the city under construction, it is as if the narrator chooses to ride along with the horse across the land and describe an entirely different side of the ritual. This episode also serves as an answer to the question why this ritual is performed, rather than the how the Sanskrit sources provide. The episode is thus used to explain to the reader that this is a political sacrifice, performed to ensure the stability of the kingdom, as well as to expand its borders, annex its neighboring regions, and thus to assert one's political power over the land. Masich is absolutely intrigued by the Ashvamedha sacrifice and tells throughout the poem about at least 3 different instances where kings performed this sacrifice, each time using completely different images. Keeping in mind Masich's bid for royal patronage, the repeated narration of the sacrifice might hint at his wish to offer political edification based on political traditions indigenous to South Asia. Another way Masich augments the text in several places is adding motivation to certain actions and events that are unexplained in the Sanskrit text. This technique of textual transposition is one of Masich's main tools for reshaping the story and pouring new meaning into it. For example, the story of King Sagara in Sanskrit tells of the cruelty of his son, Asamanja. Valmiki, the Sanskrit poet, states his savagery as a fact without exploring its origins. Masich, however, saw here an opportunity to elaborate on the circumstances that brought about this behavior, and thus again to infuse his poem with political wisdom. As for Asmanj, the heroic king nurtured him like a flower since he was little. From childhood, the king's love for him was so great that as a young man, his temperament was delicate and his nature fierce. The wine of affection taught him bed drunkenness. Like the love for beloveds, it burns hearts. He was young, arrogant, opinionated, and self-indulging. His speech was more bitter than an unripe fruit. So in other words, according to Masich, Asmanj was a spoiled brat, and the blame in a way lies with his father and his parenting style. This slight addition to the narrative thus reframes the episode and provides meaning to the described events. Moving forward from the changes and developments on the narrative level, I wish to dedicate the remaining time to discussing Masich's poetic elaboration on his material. The images, metaphors, and rhetoric added to the text by Masich are some of his tools to poetically explore the various meanings that can be gleaned from the themes the Sanskrit story provides. The long form of the Masnavi further allows him to develop complex poetic images over several verses and explore the many ways a word or a theme can be used to create meaning. In this sense, Masih partakes in the literary trend of tazegui, that is the fresh style of Persian poetry that was gaining popularity in South Asia and Iran during the 17th and 18th centuries. So let's take a look at a couple of examples from the poem to illustrate how Masih augmented the text poetically. In Valmiki's telling of the Ramayana, after Rama leaves the capital for his 14 years of exile in the forest, his father, King Dasharatha, is tortured by guilt, misery, and longing for his son. His heartache throws him into a frenzied state, and he falls in and out of consciousness for several days until he eventually dies of sorrow. In Sanskrit, this long mourning period after Rama's departure is used by the narrator to raise questions of guilt and family duty. In Masih's retelling, the poet shortens the king's misery and tells that King Jasrat, that's how he's named in Persian, died as he was looking at his son walking away through the gates out of the city. The concurrence of events in Masih's retelling allows the poet to explore Ram's departure and the demise of Jasrat in a joint manner, playing with the theme of Jan, the soul. Jasrat is thus fashioned here as a lover, not of the traditional beloved, though his love is that of a father to his child. When the pain of separation from his child has descended upon that wise king due to his love for a woman, because of that black wolf's ploy, the father has become a brother to Yusuf. He did not know that losing sight of the beloved, his soul would live like Yaqub's eyesight. With his own eyes, he saw his soul living. His eyes, like a Narcissus garden, were confused. Suddenly, while looking at his face, tears began pouring. Like the light of his eyes went away as well. His heart was restless from separation's sickness. In that restlessness came his final sleep. The glance at the beloved's face was loving, when his soul's bird flew away from the body. Whence is the surprise with him dying? His soul left, he is lifeless. How could he live? So Ram leaves the palace, and as he walks away, his father gets weaker and weaker until he dies. This powerful image is based on the poetic assertion that Ram is quite literally Jasrat's source of life. Depicting Jasrat as a tortured lover serves well Masih's attempt to recast the story of Rama as a love story after the classical Persian models and to illuminate for his readers the various forms of love one can encounter in Hindustan. And so a few verses later, Masih elaborates on the funerary rituals for King Jasrat. The king, tortured by the flames of love in life, is now consumed by the funeral fire in death. According to the custom of the Hindus, upon the agreed time, a pyre of sandal and aloe was prepared. From his love, they made a fire with great splendor. They tasted that pure drink without a cup. I don't know what the lover gains from this fate. He must burn in death and life. The fire was a gold censer, his body aloe. Love's scent turned fragrant through the smoke. On those ashes from the heart's fire, the assemblymen ignited the fire once again. Love's ruins were inhabited by flames. Like a candle, the entire body became light from burning. The wasteland of this world is of little revenue. Here, the money of existence is without demand. Leave these ruins, treasureless and snake-infested. Go like a lion among men, save your soul. This despicable dark tomb has 2 cups to offer. One is full of poison, the other blood. One must avoid its banquet and the passing of the cups, for no one should imbibe poison and blood. Masih narrations of the stages, tools, and material used in Jasrat death rituals allow him to explore the poor fate of lovers in life and death, and to comment on the meaninglessness of this world. The stages and supplies that are used in the funeral ritual are mentioned and named accurately, but receive only secondary significance here, while the poetic elaboration on them is brought to the front. The fire that consumed Jasrat was not the physical fire, but the much more powerful metaphorical fire of love for his son. The funeral fire was merely a vessel in which the fragrant firewood, that is the king's body, is consumed by the inner fire that arises from his heart. This section is the perfect example of the way Masnavis may partake in tazegui poetry. In contrast with ghazals, where the unit of analysis is normally the bait and the unity of the various verses in a single ghazal is constantly questioned, narrative poetry allows the poet to expand on the narrative poetically over several verses and create an image through poetic assertion and exemplification that does not illuminate the narrative, but rather is illuminated by it. The primacy is given to the metaphor, while the narrative events serve as a platform for the poet on which to present the meanings or universal truth that can be derived from it.
2 minutes.
Yes. Yeah. So to wrap things up, I hope I was able to give you a clear, even somewhat quick taste of Masich's work process and methods. My goal here was to move away from notions of faithfulness or equivalence as parameters to which to assess Persian retellings of Sanskrit narratives, and instead to trace and understand through close reading the processes that brought about the changes in the target text. All these simultaneous transposition processes can be seen as comprising a process of Persianization. While this is of course not an emic category per se, some Mughal era Persian translators have described their work process in similar terms. Some prose transpositions of Sanskrit stories, in some of them, the authors describe their process as Farsi kardan or Farsi neveshtan, that is to make something Persian or to write something in Persian. And one poet has described his work as transposing a song from an Indian mode so it could be played on a Pahlavi harp. The kind of analysis I offer reveals what making Persian means. The poet Persianizes his material not only by writing the narrative in the Persian language, by versifying it in accordance with Persian prosody, or by adding imagery from Persian and Islamic lore. Persianization, moreover, should not be understood as an exotic, vague euphemism for loose translation. It is a complex process that involves close reading, interpreting the story, elucidating its implicit meanings, elaborating on its themes and poetically exploring them, reducing or augmenting the narrative, and ornamenting it in accordance with the style and literary taste of the time. These can only be uncovered and analyzed when we don't give up on reading Persian retellings against their hypertexts. Thank you.
This is brilliant, Ayelet. Thank you so much. And it's a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And we are happy to be here to listen to it. Now we open the floor for the questions, Q&A. As you noticed, we are actually behind the schedule, but we have at least, like we speak about 10-15 minutes for questions. And if we want 10 minutes reassess, so we can actually go on in discussion if there are more questions. I will take, okay, so I will leave my question to the end. So now if anyone want to ask Peter or Muneer or Ayelet, please do it yourself or send it in the comment and I will read it.
I have a question, but I raise my hand, but if no one's, don't see anyone else
Yes, please,
raising their hands.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for all these very varied and interesting presentations. I have a question for Dr. Webb. This was very interesting. I've, looking at all the copying of languages that authors either do or don't know, it really opened my eyes. So thank you for that. My question is, in the Ottoman case, and I've worked with Ottoman manuscripts for a long time, and you see that there's a long-standing tradition of not writing the dots in the colophon. And I don't know if how often we see that in the Arabic and Persian traditions. Sometimes, and of course, it doesn't make sense to copy someone else's colophon, that is, copy some other copyist's person or copying information, but that does happen sometimes. And so I was wondering if you saw any examples of these colophons without, again, without any dots, being copied and being transformed in the way that you showed in your own example, and what that would say about the multilingual culture in general, because a lot of the time, as you know, the manuscripts themselves can be in Turkish or Persian or whatever language, and the colophon will still be in Arabic. And not knowing that Arabic might, again, mean a lot.
Yeah, so
thank you.
And yeah,
that is my question.
Yeah, Peter, can you answer briefly? So also we can take.
Yeah, sure. In terms of copying of colophons, I think that your usual hunch is right, that they don't have them. The colophons for these manuscripts are not very sort of informative. There are a few of these sort of muqabala and these sort of comments. The only one that has quite a lot, it's an interesting case, and of course didn't have time to go into it, but one of the Mamluk manuscripts found its way, as usual, into Constantinople. And so that has actually quite a lot of comments, and it served as an exemplar. And I think at least one manuscript does kind of copy its colophon because of its antiquity. So I think the only one that I would say that got sort of attention as a colophon would be copying a manuscript that they perceived to be very old. And so they kind of wanted to preserve the date of that one as they were recopying it. But out of like the hundreds of them, that was literally the only one. And it seemed to be the pure antiquity of the manuscript that caused their interest, to make people realize that they were copying from that old one. But it's really quite rare. You can see which ones people were copying from by other means, but not by the colophon.
Brilliant, brilliant. Clarissa, you have a question, so please go ahead. No, you didn't? Okay, okay. So any other question?
Yes, Hany, thank you. I have first for Muneer and a question for Ayelet. Muneer, very quickly, I want to endorse perhaps the Arabic origin of the Sabina, which Safina is a common title for a number of anthology texts, also not only in Arabic, but in Persian and Turkish. It's like Bustan or Tuhfa or any of these sort of like titles, just to indicate a collection of something. For Ayelet, I want to ask about, I was really taken with the last passage you showed us of the, well, basically the, excuse me, I'm trying to take my hand down, the death of the king. And it reminded, I mean, it reminded me of certain passages in Nizami or other Persian authors. It's very zuhd inflected, and by zuhd I mean denigration of this world and asceticism. It's a very familiar sentiment, and I'm wondering how it compares to ascetic notes that we might get from the original Ramayana, and I'm wondering if it's a good basis for kind of a comparative asceticism, which isn't necessarily your project, but it's very interesting to me. Thanks.
Yeah, so first Muneer will answer briefly, and after that Ayelet.
Yeah, thank you, David, for bringing that up. There are conflicting interpretations of the Sabina, and most Mapla scholars actually go with these, it's having been derived from the Arabic Safina. But my interest was not in, ascertaining the veracity of the interpretation as such, but, why does an interpretation which seeks to derive the word from the Persians Shabina, why has that actually emerged in the first place? And in that respect, it seems to me that the performative world of Arabi Malayalam has kind of also has to play some kind of role in that interpretation. So both the Safina and the Shabina, no matter how historically or they are or etymologically they are accurate, they both try to shed light on the multilingual character and also the performative dimensions of Arabi Malayalam literary culture. Thank you.
Brilliant. Ayelet, you can go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly, I would say that I think this image about the meaninglessness of this world, in this case, is not derived from the Ramayana, I would say. The epic of the Ramayana doesn't normally dwell on that. Other texts that deal with Rama's life would bring these questions more, like the Yoga Vasishta, for example, where Rama discusses the meaning of life and what's the point of all of this with his his guru Vasishta, but in the Ramayana, you know, it's a royal epic, basically. You know, like the contrasting duties of the protagonists are with between the right thing to do in one's lifetime, not so much in death. So I would say that in this case, you're absolutely right that these ideas are derived from the Persian Sufi tradition rather than ascetic traditions of South Asia.
It's brilliant, brilliant. We're still available for more questions. So if you have any, please go ahead, Claire. Yeah, you can go ahead, Claire.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all our speakers. It was like fantastic listening to you. I have a question for Ayelet. Okay, it's a question of production and reception. I wondered if you could tell us more about the basis, for the production of such a work of translation. I guess it was a work of, it was commissioned. So could you tell us a bit more about it and about the reception of the text? I was just wondering, because you seem to describe a text that really takes its independence from the source. Okay. Now I was wondering if that text was read then independently from Ramayana. You see, that is, even like Ramayana would be read by Persianate cultured people, and the text you're describing, this new version, this new text, in fact, was it also read by the Sanskrit elite, or even Hindu elite? So I'm wondering, how these texts also cross over cultures.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yes, with your first question, actually, this text was not commissioned. This was Masih, the poet. You can say that he was active like on the periphery of the Mughal court and was trying to make a bid for royal patronage, but I haven't found any mention of him in Mughal Tazkiras from the period. So, I mean, only from later periods, and no one mentions that he actually worked under a certain emperor. He lived in the time of Jahangir. But I don't know if he was that successful in gaining royal patronage as he had wanted. In the sense of reception, well, this is an interesting question, mostly because, I mean, in the early 17th century, there is not much evidence for multilingual scholars at the Mughal court. I mean, most of the translations, mostly the prose ones, the unornate ones, were produced by a group of translators that some knew Sanskrit, some knew Persian, and they interacted in the vernacular in order to render the story in Persian. So in this period, I mean, I don't know of Sanskrit scholars at the court who would have been able to read high courtly poetry in Persian. And especially, in the case of poetry, this is an independent work. As you say, this was not meant to be read side by side with the source text for a comparative project. I mean, this is an aesthetic, poetic work that tells a story beautifully and appeal to literary taste of whole other literary traditions. So I don't know about the reception of these texts, especially the poetic ones in Sanskrit circles. This text was already translated in prose earlier on in the 1580s in Akbar's court. And this was made more, I would say, for informational purposes, for the Persianate world to know better the actual content of the epic, rather than to enjoy the various meanings that can be learned from the lessons that Rama learns throughout his life. So, the differences in the purposes between prose renditions and poetic renditions are vast, and we should really take that into consideration when we're thinking about the reception of these texts. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, brilliant answer. So any left questions, briefly, like one sentence and one sentence answer, if anyone still have? No? So we are happy now. Yeah. Anyone has a question?
Barbara, I think, and Clarissa have a question, but.
Yes, please go ahead. We will eat from the reassess time, but it's okay. Clarissa, yeah.
My question is very quick, and that is, Ayelet just told us that there had been a previous translation in Akbar's court, a prose translation of the Ramayana. And my question is, are there any indications of earlier, much earlier translations of the Ramayana? Because I wonder if there are, I mean, I see parallels in some of the seer literatures. So I was wondering if there were any indications of earlier translations into Persian that might have leaked into Arabic, as some of the earlier translations might indicate. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'd love to know that, same as you. I mean, I am not aware of any earlier Persian renditions of the text, but I mean, the Ramayana is one of the most widely circulated stories, you know, in South Asia, and it has been rendered countless times in so many vernaculars in South Asia. So some sections or some, you know, sub-stories might have been circulating through the vernacular to Arabic sources, but I'm not aware of that.
And in the and in different genres, the
yes,
Indian theater tradition, which is
of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, brilliant. Barbara, can you go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you. It's a short question. I was to Peter Webb. I would like to know, the Ottoman translator came up with the correct Persian line, and well, I was asking myself, did he look it up in Ibn Asakir, or was it like widely spread so that the Persians kind of didn't need to correct the manuscripts? Or do you rather think they would have corrected them if they just said, well, I can't understand this harj at the beginning and dropped it? Thank you.
Yeah, no, very quickly, actually, no, the Ottoman translator, he got good Persian in there, but it wasn't the actual text. It was a line from Hafez. So clearly the Ottoman translator had probably memorized or knew Hafez. And so he saw something where the Ajam said something, the Arabs had said a poem. And so I think he just dropped in just dropped in a line that was completely non sequitur. So actually he kind of got it wrong, or he didn't kind of get it wrong. You know, I'm being too charitable. He got it completely wrong and he just ran off on his own. The one Ottoman copyist who did correct it, yeah, I mean, we can see that he sort of made an intervention, but it just seems that they were a little bit unclear. The evidence for it seems that the nature of the corruptions in the text suggests to me that, like, leaving them unpointed and adding wrong points in a few places, and one guy had non-bovad as opposed to be'on bovad, he put non-bovad, which I guess is like to become bread or something. I mean, that doesn't really work. And so I think that overall it's a line that's being skipped over, except we have that one Ottoman guy who clearly makes the intervention and actually adds his own version, which is correct. It's just intriguing how little that happened and how most seem to just, I'm going to leave it as it is, and there it is.
Brilliant, brilliant, Peter. Any other question we can take? It's like every answer of the question make us actually more motivated to ask more questions. So I think it's better to end the session here. And we thank all the presenter. You were more than brilliant, and we are honored and happy to have you. So.